Greetings to everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be in the world. This is Dr. John Freedman. I'm in Sonoma County, California wine country, and I want to thank you for tuning in. It's truly a pleasure and a privilege to speak to you today, especially about one of the world's most interesting and important destinations, the Mekong River region of Southeast Asia. Now, many of you may know me from past river trips or cruises in Asia or elsewhere. For those of you who I've not yet had the privilege to meet personally, I do hope to meet you in the not too distant future. Now, just a very little bit about my background. I'm an independent scholar and lecturer. My field is best described as global studies, in that my work and travels have spanned 7 continents. I've been a guest speaker on board Viking ships in Asia and beyond, and I've also been privileged to both lead educational travel programs and serve as a lecturer for National Geographic and Smithsonian, Yale alumni travel, as well as a number of other universities and museums, and numerous cruise ships and riverboats over the past 2 decades. My interest in Southeast Asia in particular has been very long-standing, dates back to my childhood, and my experience there includes dozens of trips and lecture tours, as well as overseeing a number of medical charity-related projects in my capacity as a physician, which was my primary vocation for 35 years. I retired from medical practice about 8 years ago, and my lifelong avocation became my vocation in a sort of encore career, and here we are. So finally, I would just add that in my many trips to the Indochinese Peninsula, as you'll see, I've been able to compile a rich photographic archive which we'll use today to illustrate and bring to life the world of the Mekong Basin that we're about to explore together. So thanks again for tuning in. Buckle up for an exciting ride as we explore the history, geography, biogeography, cultural anthropology, and some critical environmental issues that are facing the Mekong region today. So here we go. The Mighty Mother Mekong, being the title of the lecture, is more than just a nice alliterative title. I think by the end of this lecture, you'll see that indeed this is the great nurturer of the Indochinese Peninsula. If we blow up this map a little bit, without looking at the detail, we'll get into some of the precise geography shortly, but one can see that this river, which thunders down from Yunnan province in China, feeds the Indochinese Peninsula. You can see it's centrally located geographically, and you can see that this is indeed the lifeblood of the Indochinese Peninsula. This is something that we can just see visually with this overview, this kind of greater landscape view of the Mekong River. Now, I am going to move very rapidly. We have a lot of interesting material for you. I'm going to go as fast as you can think, which is quite fast, and you'll be amazed how much you retain, but there are things that will pique your interest, so that's why we do have a reference list that will be available to you on Viking.TV. There'll be a little box that you can click, and you can download the reference list. It's carefully curated, so it's only 1 page, but several books, a couple of films, and then some web resources. Also have a Mekong primer, which will give you kind of a summary of some of the key kind of facts and figures that I'll go through. So don't worry at all about many of the details and about retaining everything. Think of this presentation the way you would if you looked at a mosaic. It's not every little tile that you're looking at, but in fact, each individual tile together creates a picture, and that's the picture I'll paint for you. Now, this is very interesting because we can see here in that kind of yellow-orange, the Tibetan Plateau. It's also called the Tibet-Qinghai Plateau because it actually expands beyond Tibet into the Qinghai province of China. And you can see it's between the Himalayas and the great deserts of northern China, the Taklamakan Desert, which is in Xinjiang, and the Great Gobi Desert. This plateau is where all of Asia's great rivers are sourced. The Mekong, of course, and we can see the course right there. The Indus River, the Yangtze River, the Yellow River, the Irrawaddy of Burma, Myanmar, all of these great rivers of Asia are sourced up on this Tibetan plateau. I took this little snapshot of Google Earth. There's Qinghai, and right there would be where the source of the Mekong would be as best we've determined it. We'll talk about that a little more further on, and you'll be able to see indeed that we're still getting more precise every day, and perhaps a little controversial about where the source is. But that would give you the general area, and then it's going to run down through Tibet and through China. We'll see further on into the Indo-Chinese Peninsula. Notice we've got Mount Everest there. Let's see if you can see that on the slide there, right there, just to give you your bearings there. There's Mount Everest, of course, on the Nepal-Tibet border there. Now, I love this is 1950s National Geographic map, but it really gives you the sweep, the lay of the land. You get the sense of these rivers coursing down from this high plateau, coursing down the Indo-Chinese Peninsula. So I like sort of the action that's depicted in that graphic. Now, the Mekong Basin would be this large area. Sometimes catchment area is used synonymously. The term watershed is often used for individual contributors to this catchment area or basin. We'll use the word basin. The idea is that all of the people in this area are deeply, heavily affected by this great river. And we're talking about at least 60 million people. Depends on who measures it and how. Some people, some demographers have said up to 100 million people. So we're going to be conservative and say at least 60 million people. Now, much of that is due to this lifeblood, life-giving river and the fecundity that it brings, the productivity. And part of that is just due to the population in Asia, which we can sometimes forget about the population density in Asia. And I think a great infographic to remind us of that is this one, which you may well have seen. And that is, the statement tells us a lot. There are more people living inside this white circle than outside of it, more population inside that circle. So it tells us a lot about the population density in Asia. Now, what's very interesting, these rivers, in terms of going back to earliest Homo sapiens history, and actually pre-Homo sapiens, the peopling of the Indo-Chinese Peninsula came via these rivers. So it's not at all surprising that the Red River, the nidus of the Dai Viet, the early Viet civilization, which was an ethno-linguistic group that the Chinese could not assimilate, and no one's been able to assimilate the Viets. They would later move down the entire peninsula. The Mekong River, we can see it goes through Luang Prabang, which we'll talk about, the capital of the old Lanshan kingdom of a million elephants. That was an ancient Lao kingdom. Vientiane, the current capital of Laos. We'll see very importantly how Angkor and its great temples were dependent upon the Mekong. Phnom Penh, capital of Cambodia, and Saigon, which we'll see wasn't always Vietnamese. We'll tell that story a bit as we move further on. And of course, the Irrawaddy there on the west, going down to Yangon or Rangoon in Burma or Myanmar. Take your pick. When you're in Burma or Myanmar, you can really call it either way, and the people are fine with that. So the peopling of the Indo-Chinese Peninsula really is due to the course of these rivers. Now, very interestingly, in my encore lecture that I gave, it's the last Viking.TV lecture I gave, we talked about the cultural influence. So those came by sea, not by the rivers. The cultural richness, of course, from China in the east. So Vietnam was very much a Sinicized culture, and then for the Indianized Hindu and Buddhist Indianized culture from the west. And of course, they mix and mingle synergistically. But again, those are the cultural influences come in by sea. The peopling was via the rivers. Now, very importantly, this is a transnational river. This, in fact, is over 3,000 miles, about 3,050 at last measurement, and goes through 6 countries. If you consider Tibet a country, as many people do, then it would be 7 countries. But we'll say 6 countries with Tibet as part of China as we know it today. Now, this river has, for centuries, united and also divided countries in the Indochinese Peninsula. We're going to take a look here. We're going to use our little laser pointer there. Let's see if we can do that. And we're going to see how the river is coming down. We know from that Tibetan plateau, thundering through Yunnan in China, as we can see here. There's a very short China-Myanmar border there. So again, a transnational border. And then there's a Myanmar-Laos border as well. And this is followed by a short stretch of a Lao-Thai border before it goes into the interior of Laos. And then we'll see it'll once again become a lengthy Thai-Lao border. These are known as riparian borders, borders that are formed by rivers. Now, this area here where China and Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, this area is very much the Myanmar, Laos, and Thai Laos area. It's known as the Golden Triangle, this area here. And we can see right there, we have the intersecting borders of Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand. And then on the right, we can see, if you look at this point here, this is actually the political defining border between three countries here. That point right there, and there it is, Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand. Now, again, the river, we're going to come down on this river, go into Luang Prabang, a great and important city, and this is very much in the news, and we'll see why later on in the lecture when we talk about the dam building and some of the ecological issues related to the Mekong. So it goes through the interior of Laos to Vientiane, the capital, beautiful area along the capital city of Vientiane, looking over into Thailand, forms this lengthy border. Now, interestingly enough, Laos really didn't exist until the French reconstituted it. It had existed as a great kingdom, as I had mentioned, but it had been largely obliterated over hundreds of years by its imperialistic neighbors, which included Vietnam, the Cambodians, the Khmer civilization, and the Siamese or Thailand. So Laos was reconstituted, and we'll see why, because this creates the river road to China that the French were looking for. They wanted to create a dividing line, a buffer zone away. The British were in Myanmar. Thailand gave up much of its territory in order to be a buffer zone and allow the French here to keep the English off. So basically, this is very much the Mekong determined the political geography of the peninsula even today. Now you can see it flows down, goes into the interior of Cambodia. Very importantly, not right through Siem Reap here, which is where Angkor Wat is. Of course, there were hundreds of temples all throughout this region, but we'll see why this is still very, very much subject to the Mekong and its ebb and flow. And then, of course, comes down through the Cambodian capital of Phnom Penh, actually divides into two rivers in Phnom Penh, the Basak and the Mekong, then flows down into the Mekong Delta, the most fertile area of all, one of the most fertile areas on the planet. And it is known there as the Kulong. That's the Nine Dragons, as it flows down into the delta and divides and then meets its destiny in the South China Sea. So there's a good bit of the geography. Now, if we look at the map today and just look in general at the political divisions there, didn't always look like this, as you can imagine. Let's take a look at 1200 AD. Almost the entire peninsula was the great kingdom of Angkor, the Khmer Empire, that Cambodian polity, the greatest empire in the history of Southeast Asia. Note, we see the Viets, and we see Dai Viet. This was Greater Viet, the nidus of the Vietnamese civilization. The Chinese pacified it. They were there for 1,000 years, but eventually they would be extirpated, as would be anyone else that ever tried to assimilate the Viets, and that would be the Mongols, the French, the Japanese, the Americans, anyone. These people, as we know, are people not to be trifled with. They would eventually come down, take over this kingdom of Champa here, which in fact was a Indianized Hindu kingdom, and eventually the Viets would absorb the kingdom of Champa. And look at this town. This is a Khmer, Cambodian trading town of Pre Nakor. Very important. Does the location of that look familiar to you? Well, it may indeed, because that, in fact, is present-day Saigon. Because the Viets would encroach, and eventually the Mekong Delta, and as we know it today, would be very much Vietnamese. But really, for hundreds of years, this was contested. For centuries, the Vietnamese dominated it de facto, and eventually, it would be the French who would make this de jure, who would make it part of their Vietnamese colony. Let's take a look. An 1825 map. Don't look, probably can't read these details, but notice there's the delta, and if you look carefully, you'd see that it's within the Royaume de Cambodge. It's within the Kingdom of Cambodia, though it was contested, and there were a large number of Vietnamese there at that time. But again, when the French eventually developed their Indochine, their Indo-Chinese colony, they would make this part of Vietnam. Now, some recent history that relates to the importance of this region. Of course, this haunting smile of a madman, that's Pol Pot. So there he is in the jungle in 1998 before he died, but not after, during the 4-year reign of terror with that atavistic, murderous Khmer Rouge. 3 million people had passed on, putting him in the top 10 mass murderers of the 20th century for sure, and sad to say, the most efficient of all, killed more people in less time than any of the other rogues on the mass murderers of the 20th century list. You and I, every one of us watching, would have been killed because we are educated. So you've probably seen this film, but maybe time to take a look at it again to remember this history. Some more relatively recent history related to the Mekong. In 1978, Pol Pot was insane enough to attack the Vietnamese, to go in and get that Mekong Delta back, which of course, historically, had been Khmer, had been Cambodian. These incursions were not minor to any degree. Again, it was insanity to do so. This was the battle-hardened Vietnamese army that he was going up against. Remember, the fall of Saigon was 1975. And sad to say, over 3,000 people were murdered by these Khmer Rouge invaders that came in, and most of them, many of those murders were committed in schools and temples. The Vietnamese decided they had enough. They invaded and occupied Cambodia. Some thought, you recall back at the time, that they'd never leave, but in fact, they stayed about 10 years. They did the world a huge service by destroying and ending the evil Pol Pot regime. And of course, China then invaded Vietnam. Many people forget that. The idea was to teach Vietnam a lesson, because the Chinese, of course, were allies of the Khmer Rouge. But I'd say that they were bruised, not even by the Vietnamese army, just by the local militias, and they rapidly retreated. So again, the lesson continues throughout thousands of years of history: don't mess with the Viets. Now, we may think this is Vietnam's forgotten Cambodian war, but it's certainly not forgotten in Vietnam, and particularly the Chinese retaliation. So there's no love lost between the Vietnamese and the Chinese over this particular episode. Now, I like this map because notice how it shows this outcropping of the Mekong right here going up into a lake in Cambodia. This is extremely important. Again, it shows you the enormity of the influence of the Mekong on this peninsula. The greatest civilization, the Khmer Empire, we know them for this iconic Angkor Wat. Many of you have been there. Some of you might have seen my presentation on this. But what I say, and you may hear this elsewhere, but I like to think I coined the term, is that Angkor was under the hydrologic hegemony of the Mekong. It would never have existed where it is were it not for the Mekong. And let me show you why. Here's our overview of the Mekong. Now, just imagine during the mass torrential monsoon rains, imagine what happens in the lower part. We already have the glacial belt coming in from the north. Now we have in the south this massive inflow. We actually get backflow. This river that connects to this lake reverses. Instead of flowing the other way into the Mekong Delta, it actually backs up and reverses. And this Tonle Sap, which means great water, this triples or quadruples in size. It's already the largest lake in Southeast Asia, but it quadruples in size. And just imagine, again, the fecundity, the productivity of that area. That's why Angkor was often called the hydraulic city. You've seen the barrages, the reservoirs, the canals. The entire city was really built really based on the bounty of the Mekong. Just want to remind people that there's much more in this area of Angkor than just the iconic Angkor Wat. Take a look on the web. If you were to Google John Freedman Angkor Wat, you could see a little bit about that great temple itself. And if you want to see much more about the history and the glorious temples, hundreds of them, thousands existed, hundreds still exist today, and you can download some handouts from that lecture as well. Now, if we look here, we see the Mekong, perhaps not all that impressive, only the 10th longest river. The Nile and the Amazon compete for the longest, and depending on whether you're Brazilian or Egyptian, you're going to have an opinion on that. They're close. Those are the longest. It's only the 6th largest in volume. Every river on the planet is dwarfed in volume by the Amazon. The Congo and other rivers would be much greater. It's the 2nd most biodiverse, with the Amazon taking the crown. And in fact, 2020, I like to mention, was a banner year. It's an average of 100 new species a year discovered, but there were 224 new species in the greater Mekong discovered in 2020. Quite a banner year. But there's one way in which it is number one. This is a key point that I want to drive home in this presentation, and that is in its influence on the local population. It nurtures, it can sometimes devastate, it unites through transit, trade, productivity, and can divides as a riparian border. We went over some of the little historical episodes that illustrate that, but it really is the provider. Here's how lucky you can get when just gliding along the Mekong. It also gives you a sense of how welcoming the people of the Mekong Delta are. It's one of my favorite pictures of my hundreds of thousands of pictures of Southeast Asia. But the day-to-day impact, half the year this child walks to school, and half the year she rows to school. This is up in that Tonle Sap area of Cambodia. Just some pictures to just drive home the importance. This bridge across the river won't be here very long, because as soon as we get the monsoon rains, the river will flow all the way up on those banks, which you can see are actually planted as well. But the river will flow way over those banks. That river will be swept away and it will be rebuilt. 50% of the arable land in Indochina. Over 60 million people, that's a third of the population of Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam. And remember, there's a short riparian border of Myanmar as well. 30 million people in the Mekong Delta, 5 million tons of aquatic protein. Think about that. And this is aquatic protein-based diet. 80 to 90% of the protein in the diet comes from the river. 60% of Vietnam's rice production, in Vietnam is one of the greatest rice producers in the world. In fact, a few years ago, they actually overtook Thailand for number one, at least briefly, but they're always come in the top 5. 1/3 of Vietnam's GDP. That may change because Vietnam is really going high tech, and more of their economy is related to that. In fact, if you have a Samsung phone, you can bet it was assembled in Vietnam. But in any event, approximately 1/3 of the entire GDP of Vietnam can be attributed to the productivity of the Mekong Delta. Now, this is a view of the Mekong Delta. And we can see Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. Fine to call it either way. The official name will be Ho Chi Minh City, of course, since 1975, but fine to call it Saigon, its traditional name. And of course, remember, it was Pre No Cor. It was a Khmer, a Cambodian trading town. You'll notice it's not actually on the Mekong. It's on a smaller river called the Saigon River. And by the way, if you take an ocean cruise to this part of the world and you go to Saigon, do get up in the morning to travel in on that Saigon River towards the city. It's very beautiful and interesting transit there. But again, Saigon is not on the Mekong, but it is, I would say, of the Mekong. Its rice basket, its fruit basket, its fish supply, all comes from the Mekong. And it's no small point that this being the most fertile, the most productive region in Vietnam, this is one of the reasons why the North Vietnamese, who wanted, of course, to control their entire country for unification, it being a nationalist war to them, but there is no question that this fertile Mekong Delta is of great value. Now, near Saigon, about an hour away. So we call this a Kulong, the 9 dragons, where the Mekong divides and goes out into South China Sea and the Delta. But My To, it's about an hour away by motor coach. That's where you might get on a river trip. It's a wonderful town in and of itself, and then head north on the river. You'd go northwest there, and eventually you could go all the way up to the area around Siem Reap and the temples of Angkor through Cambodia. And all of these towns are wonderful towns to visit, for example, for a day trip. All very interesting towns, all very much Mekong towns, and we'll show that photographically a little further on. Sa Dec, by the way, you may know because Marguerite Duras grew up there. The book The Lover, made into an excellent film, is set there as well. Con To, all of these towns. And then eventually you'll get to this border, Chao Doc, and that's when you cross over into Cambodia. But again, these are river towns. You can even sort of get in a little traffic jam on sort of the byways there. But these are very much Mekong River towns and fascinating to see. So again, we said over 3,000 miles or 4,900 kilometers long. The latest kind of precision, although this is controversial, determination of the source is up at over 17,000 feet. Remember, up there in Qinghai, the Chinese province. And again, this is not the Mekong that we think of. This is thundering down through the mountains. In fact, it's not called the Mekong in China. It's called the Lancangjiang, which means turbulent river, aptly named. Things calm down a little bit as it goes through these beautiful mountain gorges in Yunnan. And I want to just make one point here. This is Antonio de Faria, a Portuguese mariner, explorer, and rapacious, and I use the word advisedly, pirate. He was a pirate more than anything else, but he also was a great mariner and explorer. He was the first known European to see the Mekong, probably in Vietnam, maybe in Cambodia. This is in 1540. The point I want to make with this slide is a kind of broad point, which is that anywhere that you go in Asia, wherever you may be in your travels, whether it's an ocean cruise, a river trip, overland, if you're asked the question, which Europeans were here first, the answer is always the Portuguese. And it doesn't matter whether it was Japan, China, Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia. Some people will say, well, hey, what about the Philippines? That's Spanish. And indeed, it was Spanish, but who took them there? What great mariner? Fernão de Magalhães, Portuguese, that we know as Ferdinand Magellan. So the Portuguese were first everywhere, including to the Mekong. They were also the first to see Angkor Wat, as I mentioned in my Angkor Wat lecture. It's a wonderful book, man after my own heart, mad about the Mekong. This is a fantastic account of the momentous voyage of French explorers, Dudart-Lagray and Francois Garnier. This was the kind of the Lewis and Clark expedition of the Mekong. It's called the Mekong Exploration Commission, or MEC. It was from 1866 to 68. The idea, the French saw the Mekong as the river road to China. The British were already in the Portuguese were there in Macau, the British were there in Hong Kong, had taken it in the Opium Wars. The French wanted their river road to China. Again, remember, that's largely why they reconstituted Laos, which had been essentially dissolved. Now, they couldn't get into the source, but they did get all the way into Yunnan. Here's members of the French, the Mekong expedition. They're on the steps of Angkor Wat, actually. Now, Legree would die early of typhoid, and Garnier would be the leader of this expedition. The 2 years they made it up into Yunnan until basically the river became fiercely unnavigable. They did produce an accurate map. Garnier later went to Hanoi. The French were still fighting for suzerainty over that area. He was killed in battle in Hanoi. Almost forgotten today, but it's a fantastic story. I highly recommend this book. It, of course, is on the reference list. Now, a major French expedition went to find the source about 30 years later or so in the 1890s, Russian expedition as well in 1900, and many more since. How long do you think it was before the source of the Mekong was, at least with some precision, definitively identified, at least the area? Took a while. 1994, way up in Qinghai province of China. We would attribute that to French anthropologist and adventurer Michel Peissel. Now, there's many other, it's contested where the true source is. There have been Japanese, Chinese, and most recently a Dutch team that have claimed to have found the source higher and higher. We're now over 17,000 feet, 17,631 or 5,374 meters. So the source is way up there. This is another superb book, A River's Tale, A Year on the Mekong. Ed Gargan was a New York Times Asia correspondent, then a fellow at the Beijing Institute, and spent 2 years, actually, in the 1960s in jail as a conscientious objector, refusing to go to Vietnam. But he always had this great curiosity about Southeast Asia, was fascinated with the history of the region. One reason why he was smart enough to know that was an unwinnable war. If you knew the history of that region, we would have known that. Le Docteau famously said to Robert McNamara, "You didn't read your history books, Mr. McNamara, because had we understood the history, there likely would have been no war in Vietnam." In any event, he took a year sabbatical in 2010 on the Mekong, went from Tibet all the way to the South China Sea. Some beautifully written book. I love this quote: "A river both ominous and luminescent, muscular and bosomy, harsh and sensuous, really the mother river, but also a fierce, muscular side to it." This would be the soft side. I took this near Kampong Cham in Cambodia, and you pass right through Kampong Cham if you do a river trip from Angkor area to Saigon or vice versa. A far cry from the tumultuous gorges of Yunnan. There we see the softer side. This is in Laos, where it gently cascades over step-like limestone formations. So again, this is the great food source. It's a great source of irrigation, which means not only the fruits and the vegetables, but you need to grow the feed for the livestock. It's a source of transportation. It's a superhighway. It's a source of commerce. I don't recommend drinking the water, but the locals do. I don't recommend bathing in the water. I never swim in fresh water in most of the developing world, but it's important to local people. And very importantly, as we'll see in the latter part of this lecture, very important as a source of hydropower. In fact, that's probably the biggest issue today, as we'll see. So we can say, above all, Mother River, the provider. And in fact, Mekong actually means mother water. So the provider, the great provider, if it rises too high or too fast, this is from John Kie in Mad About the Mekong, people drown. If it rises too little or too late, people starve. Now, the foundation of civilization in Asia, and certainly in Southeast Asia, is wet rice farming. So you can imagine how important this is as a source of nutriment. And we can see it's still beautifully, in a very picturesque scene here of the wet rice farming along the Mekong. And remember, all of these rice paddies, they're ecosystems unto themselves. I was cycling from Da Nang to Hoi An in central Vietnam, and I saw this man. He clearly was doing something out there, and I went to talk to him. He kept leaning down and picking things up, and it turns out he was gathering some fish from the rice paddies. In Laos, I saw these two young girls were doing the same thing. They had a little bag full and they were bending down, and what were they picking up? They were picking up these little freshwater crabs that are used to give this samtam, this papaya salad, a delicious flavor. So you'll see rice everywhere, and you'll see it transported. Again, this is commerce. This is transportation. The river is not just allowing for the growth, but for the transport and the exchange for the trade. Every type of rice, literally 500 different types of rice are grown in Vietnam. Here's what we like to think of as a floating market, and to us it's novel, but to them this is very normal. This is the market. Again, the river brings these agricultural riches, and the river also enables them to be passed on. This is actually Can Tho, one of those numerous Mekong towns that you might visit there. It's great when you go to these markets. It's easier than many of the supermarkets you might go to in your hometown, because you don't have to wonder where things are. You don't have to go on your iPhone to locate the aisle. You can just see there's the bananas, and there are those are white beets, I believe, and some garlic hanging down there. So that's how you find what you're looking for. And you can find anything imaginable. I do want to mention, because I often get asked the question, most of these boats have these two eyes on the front, and that's very interesting. It's an ancient tradition, and it's a talisman. It's what we call an apotropaic talisman. Apo meaning away, trope to turn. So basically, it's warding off bad luck, bringing good luck. Similar to a rabbit's foot or a four-leaf clover, maybe. It might have been to ward off the crocodiles that were there in years past, but they are no longer a problem. But you'll see those on all these boats, and those are designed to ward off any evil or bad luck. Again, this gives you a sense. These towns are all very interesting. This is Kai Bay. One of my favorites is this beautiful, splendor-spired French Gothic cathedral is right along the river there. Absolutely beautiful. Again, we can see this riverine life. We can see how this river influences these people. This is actually up in that stretch in Myanmar. You can see it's a bigger river. There's more flow there. It's not quite as gentle as the river becomes as we get further down south. Now, just a little bit on all these fruits. I like to do this. This is kind of fun. I do a lot on biogeography and the odysseys of botanicals and foodstuffs of the world, how they've traveled the world. This is a tough one, and there may be some debate about this. Depends on who measures it and how. It can often change from year to year, but let's use some of the recent FAO, that's the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN data. The #1 most eaten fruit in the world might surprise you, and there's a lot of it in the Mekong. That would be the mango. It's the national fruit of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Philippines. It's all over Asia. Its provenance is Asian. Its origins are there. We now can pinpoint those things thanks to genomic analysis. So it's quite fascinating. And you'll see it all over the Mekong area, particularly in the Delta. One of the reasons it's one of the most eaten fruits is because it's eaten as a salad as well when unripe. And it makes a delicious salad there. You might see something like this in Vietnam. Second most eaten fruit in the world, grows very well in the Mekong, and that would be the banana. Also indigenous to India and Southeast Asia. No problem finding bananas on the Mekong, and bananas of many different sorts. And again, they don't just eat the fruit that we eat, the flowers as well. That's the blossom there. And if you look inside, it's quite labor intensive. You have to peel away each layer to see those little flowers. Then you have to soak them in a little lime juice and water to prevent them from oxidizing. That makes a great salad, a banana flower salad. Then number three, I think, is quite interesting and ubiquitous in the Mekong. That, of course, is the papaya. And we might think, well, of course, that's indigenous as well, but it's not. So it's just a whole other lecture or even lecture series. But just imagine before Columbus's voyage to the New World and kind of re-knitting the seams of Pangaea, bringing all the old continents together again as they had been hundreds of millions of years ago, that among the many things would be papaya. It, in fact, is native to southern Mexico. But all of these fruits and vegetables and botanicals that have traveled the world is quite interesting. And very often the migrants actually, migration favors the migrants because in their homelands, there's been millions of years of evolution of the predators and pests that destroy these crops. Then you transplant them and they can grow extremely well on the other side of the world. So papaya would be one example of that. And again, very much eaten as a salad as well as a fruit, most famously the delicious somtam in Thailand. Many of you have had that, but watch out. Remember, if they ask you if you want 1, 2, 3, or 4 of these bird's eye, these red Thai chilies, I would say go for a half, unless you really want it to be nuclear. And again, peppers, new world crop, but they thrive in the Mekong. Pineapples also from Brazil and Paraguay thrive in the Mekong region. Melons came from Africa, and we can see how crops will thrive here. Anyone knows what this might be? It's really all the rage now in our supermarkets. That's coconut water. Coconuts, again, they would be, in fact, Asian and Southeast Asian in their origins. This is the most picturesque, the dragon fruit. It can look almost alien-like the way it grows on a vine here, and it kind of bursts out of the vine, but it can also look quite beautiful when it's served. And one of the prettiest of all is this deep red, violet-colored version. Anyone knows what this is? This is the rambutan. These are Southeast Asian. You'll see these all over the Mekong, quite delicious. This was Queen Victoria's favorite. Some say that it was a key reason why she wanted Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles to build a colony in a swampy fishing town on the end of the world of the Malay Peninsula. Of course, that was Singapore, the mangosteen. Now, these two you need to be very careful about. You'll see these in the Mekong. They're very different, the jackfruit and the durian. The jackfruit, wonderful, delicious. See, it has all these little tiny spikes on it. You can identify it. You can also identify it because it's the one you'll see the most. It's sold everywhere. It has a delicate kind of pineapple-y banana flavor. These are huge, so you'll get innumerable pods from one of them. But the durian is very different. As you can see, it looks a little different there, more fleshy, and the spikes are much bigger. And this is something you need to be careful about because the durian, infamously, has a flavor and aroma which is kind of a mix of Limburger cheese and maybe rotten onions with some dirty old socks mixed in. So it's an acquired taste for sure. There are many hotels in Asia where you can bring in a gun, but you can't bring a durian in. Fines are high on airplanes for bringing a durian. And here's a taxi that says, if you bring a durian inside this vehicle, it's a rent-a-car, you're going to get charged an extra day, because if this vehicle pervades with pungent smell of durians. So again, not for beginners, but you can try maybe the ice cream if you want to try the durian. And by the way, if you're in Saigon, the best durian ice cream and perhaps the best ice cream I've ever had, right up there with some of the ice cream in Venice, would be Fanny ice cream in downtown Saigon. Every tropical flavor you can imagine. This is the soursop. See this all over the Mekong. Makes a wonderful juice there, and ice cream as well. Close relative, the custard apple. These are rose apples. One of the fun things is you'll see fruits that you may have never seen before. It's quite fascinating. This one also, you can tell from the name, which sounds like it's Spanish in origin. And in fact, it is from southern Mexico. I like the other name, the chocolate fruit. You might call it caramel fruit based on the color and the flavor. This is the star apple because you see on the right there, that central part of it looks stellate. It's also known as milk fruit because it has this milky pulp. These are the longan. You've seen these. These are native to southern China and Indochina. It's a woody shell-like capsule. Inside is a sweet grape-like fruit. These you'll also see, particularly in Buddhist temples, native to Southeast Asia, extremely fragrant. It's a citron, but it's known as the Buddha's hand. Anyone know what these are? Look kind of familiar, particularly that bottom part. These are actually native to the Americas, to Brazil, but these grow extremely well in the Mekong. Here's a couple of kids in a Cambodian village. They were holding this, and I showed this to them. It is a cashew, of course, and the nut is on top there. And I showed them, I had an iPad, and the iPad had just come out, and I showed them on a map where the cashew comes from. They were quite fascinated by that. These grow in enormous trees. When I say big, that's one tree there on the left there. And I'll show you the largest cashew in the world. I'm standing by it. Unfortunately, it's not real, but it would certainly win the Guinness Book of World Records. What country do you think is the largest producer of cashews in the world? Remember, these are native to Brazil, but in fact, Vietnam is the #1 cashew exporter in the world. Black pepper native to India. That's why Da Gama went to Calicut, and he went, and the Portuguese created the pepper ports. That dried skin is what really gives us the fragrance with hundreds of compounds in it. I would just mention quickly that the black, green, white, and red peppercorns, they're all from the same plant. It's just a little bit related to how you process them. Who's the biggest producer of black pepper in the world today? That would be Vietnam, over 1/3 of the world's share. Cacao, this is where we get chocolate, of course, native to originally the Amazon, then taken to Mesoamerica, where the Maya and the Aztecs made it part of their culture. And Cortez, the conquistador, was wise enough to send it back to Europe, and the rest is history. These seeds, of course, are what we make chocolate out of. And I would mention that you're all probably familiar with the single origin kind of designer chocolate phase. Well, all of these Mekong towns are proud of their local chocolates. So Ben Tre, Lam Dong, Bang Ria, they all have their own single origin chocolate. This is one of my favorite fruits. It's beautiful, it's delicious. You might not be able to recognize this one. I kind of just show you this just because it's a lot of fun to see and experience all these different fruits, and it gives you a sense of the productivity of this Mekong basin. It's known as the gok fruit in Vietnam, Momordica. Notice the Latin name, Momordica cochinchiniensis. Now remember, I mentioned that the French made the Mekong Delta part of Vietnam. In fact, if we look at French Indochina, you can see Vietnam had 3 parts. Tonkin, you all know the Gulf of Tonkin comes from that. Annam, which was central Vietnam, and Cochinchina. Remember, Cochin was a great pepper port that the Portuguese had established. So this was the French version of having a port in the Orient. Also great juice, Momordica juice. Now again, not just fruits, vegetables, everywhere. Again, this gives us a sense of the productivity of the region of this delta. And notice, as I mentioned, when the river goes down, those banks are farmed. These muddy waters are very nutrient rich, and in the dry season, the slopes are used for cultivation. Also in the dry season, we get some islands emerging in the river, and those are also planted seasonally as well. These are bamboo shoots. These are lotus stems, which are used in salads as well. You can see there's quite a delicious one that I took a picture of. Now the lotus, of course, is ubiquitous in Asia. It's particularly something that you'll see all over the Mekong. It's not a water lily because it actually grows above the water line. It grows on a stem. In fact, I think that's key to the iconic nature of the lotus. If we look at it, It's a thing of great beauty and purity, which rises out of muddy waters. Thus it is the metaphorical symbol of the path to enlightenment. And so we'll see that commonly in Buddhist iconography. Those of you who have been with me for my Buddhism series know that we'll see the lotus in many, many manifestations. It has many meanings and great importance in Buddhism. These are all Buddhas sitting on a lotus throne. This is a picture I took early in the morning. In fact, we were out in ox carts. This is on the Mekong. We were out, we got off, we took some ox carts as the sun rose, and I took this, and very interestingly, I like this picture of a lotus before it opens because this gives us a sense of the shape of these towers. And of course, Angkor Wat was originally Hindu before it became Buddhist, and it was based on Hindu temples in Java. That's where the great Khmer God King who established the kingdom of Angkor largely spent his youth. So notice the lotus-shaped towers. There are five towers in Angkor Wat in what's known as a quincunx, 4 on the corners and 1 in the center. But you'll see the lotus everywhere in the setting of Buddhism. And one that I like to show, and I've shown this to many university groups, to Yale, Harvard, Stanford, many museum groups. I've shown this in hundreds of lectures to hundreds of groups. No one's ever gotten this. I'm sure there's someone listening to this who knows the answer, but where's the lotus in this picture? In fact, it's the Buddha's cloak, because the Buddha's cloak is made from fibers from the lotus stem. They're woven and they are dyed with natural dyes. More on the lotus, eating every part of it, nothing is wasted. The root, this is the seed cup. Very importantly, the seeds, which are eaten raw, dried, ground into a paste for cakes and pastries, they're thought to have medicinal value to promote fertility. This is more symbolic, I think, than evidence-based, but the dried seeds can still germinate after 1,000 years. So it's not surprising that they might be considered at least symbolic of fertility, if not efficacious clinically. I don't think we have the science really to support that. Again, you'll see every kind of melon in every shape and size, and then you'll see things that you can't quite identify. I wondered what these were, so I had to go and buy one and taste it, and it was a sweet cucumber. This is a great one too. Anyone recognize this? That's a white eggplant. So again, we'll see many things in the Mekong, and this is all designed to show you the tremendous productivity of this river, which, as we'll see further on, may be threatened. This, famously, is betel nut. Now, that's a portmanteau word. Some people say it's a misnomer. I would say, no, it's a combination of the 2 key ingredients. On your left, you can see the betel leaf, and on your right is the areca nut from the areca palm tree. You chew them together along with a little lime to activate it. One interesting thing, if we look at the betel nut chewing countries of the world, is that we can see that the Mekong Delta is right smack in the middle of that betel nut region. These are the betel leaves. They're actually in the pepper family. You'll see them growing all over the Mekong, and there are the areca nuts. They both, certainly the areca palm nuts, have a number of pharmacoactive and psychoactive ingredients. The leaf as well may. Much of this is under study. And one thing I can tell you for sure, although this kind of don't worry, be happy vibe around betel nut sometimes make us view it sort of whimsically, and this clearly is the best betel nut smile I've ever seen. This lady An sells incense in Vietnam. This is a serious health problem. This is clearly associated. It's taken years of epidemiologic work, but it's incontrovertible. The evidence is crystal clear. This is associated with oral cancer, squamous cell carcinoma. It's associated with gum disease. It's also associated with the spread of TB, which is spread through aerosols, and betel nut chewers do a lot of spitting. So clearly, when it comes to betel nut, the governments of these countries and everyone should just say no from a health standpoint. Now, again, livestock as well is very important. When you have your foie gras, this would be the chicken pho. You could get pho bo, which is the beef, or foie gras. You can be sure that not only that all the vegetables in it, but the livestock as well likely came from the Mekong region. I did a little piece on Saigon called Simmering Saigon. You can find that on the reference list or just Google it, which uses that sort of metaphor of the pho with all its savory and many rich ingredients as kind of a metaphor for the city of Saigon itself. But really, it's the aquatic protein that is most important. As we said, this is the vast majority of protein in the diet. This is the #1 inland fishery in the world. In other words, there's no river, not the Amazon, not the Congo, not the Nile. There's no river that yields this kind of aquatic protein yield of 5 million tons a year. So over 1,500 species, and about 10% of those are part of the diet. This is $9 billion a year. Fishing in every way imaginable, depending on what part of the river you're in, what country you're in. This takes a lot of skill to fish, do any fishing on Cone Falls, but we'll see why they'll do it. And by the way, this is in the southernmost point of Laos. Some people divide the upper and lower Mekong right here below the falls is considered the lower. Others think of, the northern part in China as the upper Mekong. So there's no exact definition, but this is kind of a dividing point because after Cone Falls, this is the largest falls on the river. There are no more after this. But why are they there? What are they doing there? I know this seems like a literally incredible statistic, 3 million fish per hour. The reference for that statistic is on the reference list in this study by internationalrivers.org. So very important site for migratory fish. Think about that, migratory fish that need to move along the river. And think about that when we start to talk about the mainstream dams that are being built. Now, again, source of food and also the livelihood for many. A high percentage of people actually make their livelihood fishing in this great inland fishery. About half, by the way, is farmed and half is wild caught. Wild caught, #1 in the world, no other river yields as much. Again, just some pictures to give you a sense how this is life in the Mekong and how they need that river, and any environmental concerns and ecological concerns are really of enormous magnitude, as we'll see. And by the way, many of the fish are dried or partially dried. It both helps preserve them, but it concentrates the flavor as well. And when I say aquatic protein, remember, there's a lot more than fish. There's snails, there's frogs. We certainly don't eat the soft-shelled turtle, but this can bridge us to the idea of the many fascinating and endangered species. And imagine now if we alter the ecology of the river. They're doing everything they can. This is kind of a Lazarus species, a species that was thought to be extinct. When I say kind of, it's because it wasn't universally believed that it was extinct, but it was hard to find evidence that they still existed. But now they're really coming back thanks to some great efforts locally and internationally. In fact, they put 3,000 hatchlings in 2021 until now, later 2022. There have been over 3,000 hatchlings, these tiny little soft-shelled turtles. Now, again, the dams, as we'll see, you can imagine, potentially threatening the entire fish population, but imagine these mega fishes of the Mekong trying to get through some of these dams. And again, we'll talk about that in more detail. Not only is this fish big, it's the largest freshwater fish that has ever been caught. So June 20th, 2022, the new Guinness World Record. This was a 660-pound, 4 meter, 13 feet or so. Previous Mekong record was not quite as big. Paradoxically, the catching of this fish actually heartened environmentalists. It's a sign of hope that a fish can still grow this big and that they're still there. The key is, with all the dam building, to keep it that way. This is the Mekong giant catfish. This is the largest of the 92 species of catfish. This one's 10 feet long, over 600 pounds. These are near extinction, and the dams are thought to be contributing to that. There's also some overfishing, although they're protected now, and some general habitat destruction with development. This is in the family of giant shark catfishes. It is a catfish, and they're large, as you can see. Again, I don't recommend swimming in the Mekong, and if you did, I don't think you'd be able to swim alongside them. But if you did, because you'd have trouble finding them, but if you did, you wouldn't have to worry, because as fearsome as they look, they are edentulous, they have no teeth, and they are herbivorous, so you'd be safe. So I'd say it's kind of like, forgive me for putting this in, but about 2 weeks ago, I was in the Bird's Head Peninsula of New Guinea on the Papua Indonesian side, swimming with the whale sharks, and they too are harmless, and you can swim with them. Perhaps someday we'll be able to swim with a restored population of Mekong catfish. Now, the dolphins are threatened. These are very closely related, if not identical, to the Irrawaddy dolphins in Burma. Sadly, if you look at the IUCN Red List, this is an excellent website, by the way, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. Just pull it up, type in any species, and it'll tell you where they fall on the spectrum. But they are critically endangered. Sadly, I've been watching this closely. There was a subpopulation of dolphins that lived just south of that Cone Falls. There's a little pool. They've been well studied, but they were shown to be dwindling. They were down to just one, as you can see. This is October 2021, as a 25-year-old male. Sad to say, he's gone. He died in February of 2022. There are still thought to be about 80 to 90 left. They're in southern Cambodia. Now, fortunately, there are new species being discovered all the time, as we mentioned, and 100 species per year on average. And some of these are amazing, like this leopard gecko that was recently discovered. For more on this, take a look in the reference list at the World Wildlife Foundation's Greater Mekong section. I also want to mention that there's something very spiritual about the river, as is true for all rivers, one might say. These are gazebos, meditation gazebos amidst a lotus pond on the Mekong. And wherever you go, you'll see stupas, you'll see shrines where you can go in and see. Again, this has a lot of spiritual value as well. Now, Ed Gargan wrote, "A Mekong journey is a voyage through the heart of Asia's complexity." And I think that's very, very true. The riparian borders, again, when we talked about the ones between Laos and Thailand, these are highly artificial, as we mentioned. When the Siamese basically invaded that area, they razed, completely destroyed Vientiane. They took the Lao king Anuvang, captured him, brought him back to Bangkok in a cage. He died not long after there. Again, the French reinvented Laos, including the name, really by cutting progressive deals with the Siamese in return for protection from the British, who were encroaching from the west. In Vientiane, King Anuvang, his spirit lives on. Here he is looking over the Mekong towards Thailand, towards the land that was taken from the great kingdom, the Lanshang, a kingdom of a million elephants, the ancient Lao kingdom. So he's overlooking the Mekong and Vientiane, looking longingly west across the river into Thailand at territory lost to the imperious Siamese. Take it back someday, is he thinking? Highly unlikely. This is a view from Vientiane looking across into Thailand. Can walk along the riverside promenade. Now, this is a National Geographic article. By the way, this National Geographic archive is fantastic. You can see every article from 1888 onwards. But you'll remember, if you were looking at National Geographic and reading about the Mekong in 1966, not the Mekong we know today. Look at the title of this article, Mortal War in Vietnam. Imagine fighting in the jungles and the byways of the Mekong. But again, they were fighting not only on the Mekong, they were fighting for the Mekong, the rice bowl of Southeast Asia. And we all remember these times, I think. Now, in the movie Apocalypse Now, this was a 1979 film. You all know it well. There are many scenes on the Mekong and its byways. And what I like to think of, there's great characters in that film, right? Brando's Colonel Kurtz and Martin Sheen's Willard. No one will probably ever forget Robert Duvall's Colonel Kilgore. Remember the drug-crazed journalist Dennis Hopper. Anyone recognize this young fella? That's Harrison Ford as a young man, as Colonel Lucas. And this 14-year-old actor, that's Lawrence Fishburne as a teen soldier, Clean. But keep in mind, if you look at this film, one of the main characters is the river itself. So very important to the story of Apocalypse Now, as it was in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And when I look at Roger Ebert's final 10 best films of all time, this was his last list shortly before he died in 2013. Apocalypse Now was number 3. But I find it interesting that just above that is another film where the river is the central character, or a central character. That's Werner Herzog's Zagira, The Wrath of God. It's the Amazon River, of course. Now, we move 20 years later, we look at stories in National Geographic, and now A Haunted River's Season of Peace. This is post-war. It took 2 decades. Remember the timeline here. The first U.S. ground troops came ashore in Da Nang on March 9th, 1965. Paris Peace Accords were in January 73, and the last U.S. combat troops were out by March 73. Fall of Saigon was April 1975. So we're now 20 years later. The killing fields of Southeast Asia are still. Along the region's major river, development attests to the hopes of Six Nation. This is a river with promises to Cape. The Mekong figures brightly in the region's plans. Free-flowing trade has resumed, and a friendship bridge will soon link capitalist Thailand and communist Laos. The first bridge, international bridge, would be built. And in fact, it was built in 1994. And the first major bridge over the Mekong. There are now a total of 94 bridges over the Mekong. You will see several of them if you take a river trip. This is the Kampong Cham Bridge. This is the hometown of Hun Sen, who has long been the Prime Minister of Cambodia. This is the My To Bridge outside of Saigon. You'll see this if you board a river trip here. And this is a river in Kai Bay, the town that, as I mentioned, Margaret Duras, this is the bridge there where Margaret Duras grew up. So again, I think we've established this river as provider. Now we'll get to the final part, which is the potential ecological disaster in the making. We're really in uncharted waters, as it has been said, regarding where and how the Mekong will adapt and survive the many assaults on it. Damming will be the big one, deforestation, as elsewhere in the world, and again, development, the blasting, polluting, the sand mining, which is a major industry, sand mining for concrete. Now, there is a Mekong River Commission that's been established. It's a multinational watchdog NGO. Notice there's 4 countries there. Look at the flag. There's Cambodia with Angkor Wat on the flag. There's Laos, there's Thailand, and there's Vietnam. But something's missing. Who's conspicuously absent? Well, Myanmar, maybe they have that very short stretch, but very importantly, China is absent. Now, this commission has quite a difficult job. It really is the balance between development, versus endangerment of the fauna, the flora, the livelihoods, and the health of this population. And we said over 60 million people. Now take a look. This is right up to date, to the minute, the 2022 dams. There's 13 mainstream dams. There's hundreds on the tributaries already, but these are mainstream dams. So 13 operational, 1 under construction, 10 planned there. Now look up in China, which are most of the operational dams, way up on the upper Mekong, or what they call, remember, the Langkang-Jiang. Now I've been following this for many years, so this actually is a 2010 article on China was just beginning its dam building up in Yunnan. And this dam opened, the Xiaowan Dam opened in late 2010. It's the second biggest dam project after the Three Gorges Dam, 958 feet high. It's the highest arch dam in the world. The reservoir behind the dam has a storage capacity equal to all of the other Southeast Asian reservoirs combined. So again, second biggest dam in China. Sinhydro is China's largest hydropower developer. It's currently the largest dam builder in the world. They're all over Africa and Asia as well. So we've got 11 operational dams. The concern is China can control the flow of water. Could China use its dams to weaponize water? The answer is almost certainly yes. Would China use its dams to weaponize water? In other words, to exert potent political influence and be able to coerce countries downstream into meeting its own objectives? That's a question I guess everyone in time will answer that question, but it's a concern. Now let's look at Laos, because this is very, very important. There's 2 open, 7 are planned, but Laos's intention, self-proclaimed intention, is to be the battery of Asia. This is an extremely poor country. They want to harness their greatest resource, which is this river. And remember, it runs all through central Laos as well as along the borders. So Laos's vision is to be the battery of Asia. And I want to focus a little bit on the Shayaburi Dam. Now, I've been talking about this for a decade because it was under great controversy and conflict. It has now actually, as we'll see, progressed to the point, I guess I won't give away the spoiler to see what ultimately happened, but this was proposed, this $3.8 billion project. The downstream neighbors were extremely concerned. I mean, Laos's total GDP is $9 billion, and they're building this almost $4 billion dam. It was widely protested. The Thai people were opposed to the Thai government, which was backing this because they're going to get the 1,285 megawatts of power. Interestingly enough, the engineers are Finnish. It's financed really by Thailand. I add China in there because China has a major interest in the Lao Electricité du Lao, the Lao power provider infrastructure. So the finances are complex. The dam itself was financed primarily by Thailand in return for a contract of getting at least 95% of that electricity, which was pre-purchased. Now, again, there was a lot of concern. It drew, as this article says, ire from the downstream neighbors and environmentalists. This is actually the Prime Minister of Vietnam who said this. 33% of Vietnam's GDP, 90% of its rice exports, 60% of its seafood exports are at risk if this dam is completed due to disruption of flow that threatens the integrity of the delta. Again, widespread protests in Thailand itself, in Cambodia, and in Vietnam as well. These are Thai protesters. Remember, just across the river, this forms the riparian border. They're on the Thai side, so they wouldn't get arrested, just across from Vientiane, protesting this dam. They're alleging negligence. They're suing the government, actually, in assessing, saying the government has not sufficiently assessed the ecological and the human impact. Remember, to begin with, you have to relocate thousands of people in order to do this, and that's not easy. I think this gentleman says it best after he was relocated. I miss the Mekong. It's been his life. This is an artist's rendering. The major problem here, the biggest, well, one of many concerns, is the fish migration. Much of this technology has not been sufficiently validated. There have been studies done, but we really don't have the preponderance of evidence to make it clear that fish migration patterns, not to mention the redistribution of the nutrients, how the various solutes and the various flows of the river, you can imagine the enormous impact. So to me, as a former physician, I remember, and I worked quite a bit in the intensive care unit and the operating room, we would never use a technology without having it validated. It was often 5, 10 years or more to validate a specific technology before it would be used. I don't really see that we have the evidence base, and I think this is the concern of those who have protested, is that we really don't know how this will affect the fish migration patterns. We don't know, despite some of the ingenious ideas that have gone into making this, quote, fish friendly, we really don't know the impact. And many have said already that there's depleted fish population. This, of course, can have secondary adverse effects. So at the time it was being built, it seemed like a gamble. The technology had not been sufficiently tested, so therefore it's high risk. This has been said, they're playing Russian roulette with the livelihoods of over 60 million people. Again, it's not something we would do in many, many parts of the world. Why is it acceptable to do it here? And again, it goes beyond the livelihood. This is also a health issue. Remember, 50% of Lao children are already undernourished. 80 to 90% of the protein in their diet comes from fish. So protein malnutrition can slow mental development. That means poorer performance in school and all of the life consequences which follow. This was a while ago. I was in Laos on a medical project, actually delivering some pulse oximeters and training people in some other technologies. And I had a chance to talk to the Lao people. The fellow on the right here is the chief of infectious disease at Mahoset Hospital in Vientiane. His wife is a nurse. His brother next to me is a veterinarian. And, you know, they have some ambivalence about what might happen to the Mekong based on these dams. But again, it's a difficult issue in Laos because they feel that they very much have the right to harness this resource, and they feel they're doing it as carefully as possible. I think where we really got a sense of what drives this is we had a chance. These were some students. We were at the hospital, and they asked if some students who were learning English could come and talk to us. And I talked to them. That's my wife, Tina, in the middle there with the sunglasses and the hat. But I talked to them a little bit, and their view was very much, this is our resource. We have the right to use this resource. We don't have to be, you know, a poverty-stricken country, and we'll do it carefully. And they really believe in this dream of being the battery of Asia. But there's a lot of risks and downsides to it. Really, are they harnessing it, or could this, perhaps hyperbole, killing the Mekong, but certainly affecting it? They need clean electricity, but they also need the fish and rice that an undammed river provides. There's also other issues here. Laos has had several dam collapses. None of these dams, these are saddle dams. None of these dams have been as big as Shayaburi, nowhere near as big. And even when these occurs, these are catastrophic events. So this is another issue, the integrity of the dam, and some of them have been shown to be due to structural inadequacy, if not outright defects. So this is another concern, that a dam of this magnitude needs to be built extremely well, or it's courting disaster. Again, these other dam collapses are a cautionary tale. So 40 NGOs got together in 2014 and said, we're going to stop this. They gave themselves and the Thai government and the Lao government, who were collaborating on this project, a year to either get, really to basically divest and end the dam project. That year passed. Unsurprisingly, nothing happened. The lawsuits that were filed against the Thai government They lost in Thai court, then went to the Thai Supreme Court on appeal. That we would go back and forth. I would see this dam, they would stop building, the protests would occur, some studies would be done. Again, these aren't the kind of definitive peer-reviewed studies that we'd like to see, and Laos would then defend its plans and continue. And I will say that on October 29, 2019, the Shayaburi Dam opened. Some viewed this very, very darkly. The Mekong will cease to be a bounteous source of fish and a guarantor of agricultural richness. Inside this great river, instead, the Great River Road to China will become little more than a series of unproductive lakes. There are desiccated riverbeds downstream from Shayaburi. This is after the opening. This is July 2021, driest ever. This is supposed to be the rainy season, by the way. Is this due to climate change? Does this have something to do with China's dams far upstream, or could this be due to Shayaburi? The locals are certainly saying we don't have the quantitative definitive studies, but the people downstream are not happy and blaming what they feel to be a very much reduced fish catch on the dam. And here's another big issue. For sure, the color of the river has changed. And this is due to a phenomenon called hungry water. It's more blue-greenish, less brown, because there's decreased sediment and solute as a result of the hydrodynamic changes, which means this is pure physicochemistry, that when there's less solute, gives the water greater solubility downstream. This means increased erosion of the shoreline. Loss of silt deposits downstream can also interact negatively with rising sea levels, which we know is another big issue, and that can cause increased saltwater intrusion, which then can devastate agriculture. So I think this is also a very important issue. There's no question that there's less sediment. The color change is quite obvious. Sad to say, the Supreme Court, the Thai Supreme Court, dismissed the suit. Laos is pushing ahead with additional dams, 2 open, 7 planned. Again, the idea being the battery of Asia. There's the Paklay Dam south of Shayaburi. That's next up. They're already displacing thousands of residents from more than 20 villages. But the last one I want to mention to you is this, one of my favorite cities. Perhaps if you asked me the most charming city in Southeast Asia of great historical importance, fascinating culturally, it would very likely be Luang Prabang. This is a beautiful riverside city, a jewel of the Mekong, and really a quintessential riverside city. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It was the capital of the Longshan Kingdom. When I say riverside, I mean riverside. This is a view from the veranda of the little hotel that I stayed in there. Again, for 350 years, from 1353 to 1707, the Lanshan, the great kingdom of a million elephants, was centered there. This was very important. If you doubt the importance of the Lanshan Empire, you can see Lao has named its #1 beer after that empire, so that tells us how important it was. In all seriousness, this is an artist's rendition of what this might look like. Now, there's Luang Prabang. It's in central Laos. It actually means, Luang means royal, and Prabang is the city's iconic and distinctive Buddha. It gets its name from this famed Buddha. It has this, those of you who have heard, been with me and we've discussed Buddhist iconography, the palm facing forward and pointing upward is a symbol of the Buddhist mudra, or hand position, of fearlessness. Fearlessness that comes from within you, not that the Buddha will protect you, but that you will learn to live and be fearless through your study of the spiritual teachings of the Buddha. But it's very distinctive here. It's a double abaya. Usually it's one hand up, and that comes from this historical Luang Prabang Buddha, which is, of course, paraded yearly in an annual ceremony. And anyway, in any event, it's a beautiful historical town. It's a river town, as you can see. The river is the lifeblood. That's its history. That's its spirit, and that's its provider as well. So what's it going to be like if this dam is built? This is bigger than Shiapuri, 1,400 megawatts versus 1,200. There are many villages that will be displaced. What does this mean for the heritage, for the soul of Luang Prabang? It's been said if Luang Prabang becomes a lakeside town, as it will if this dam is completed, its authenticity and integrity will be lost forever. And in fact, they have still already started some preliminary building. So I fear the die is cast if Shiapuri is any indication. And I followed that for 12 years or more, and the course was inexorable. Last, we'll finish with what about Cambodia? Remember, all of the other countries upstream are affecting Cambodia, but they have two major mainstream dams planned themselves. One Stung Treng just south of the Lao border, one at Sambor. So this is two of the 10 planned mainstream dams. These are financed entirely by China, as is just about everything else, every other major project in Cambodia. For a while, it seemed like opposition from the locals and international environmentalists had succeeded in derailing the plans. Here's the headline: they scrapped the plan. This is 2020 for those two dams. Sadly, that headline is far too sanguine and, in fact, incorrect. What they announced was a moratorium. Cambodia's Hun Sen, prime minister, announced a moratorium. The language was soft, really, until further notice type of language. If anyone was skeptical about this, sadly, this project has been resurrected. This is September 2022. Very recently, they announced they're moving forward on, quote, further studies. Picture there is Mr. Sarat. He's the head of the fishing cooperative in the area, so you can see he's not very happy. So is this the slow death of a river? Is that hyperbole? We know that we read in the press things that can often be exaggerated. The headlines are often exaggerated. Well, it may or may not be, but I can certainly say that we are entering uncharted waters. So to read more about this is an ongoing, unfolding chapter. Take a look at the Mekong Eye. It's one of the very important reference sites. It's Bangkok-based international consortium focusing on providing information on developments in the Mekong Basin. Again, there's the URL, simplemekongi.org, but take a look at it on the reference list, and many other organizations. And again, I've curated that list, so take a look at some of the URLs there and click into these websites, and you can learn more about protecting these rivers, and if you're so inclined, about what you can do to help. There are a lot of active Protect the Mekong initiatives. This is a book that focuses on the complex, interrelated political, historical, economical, and environmental issues, particularly focusing on the Mekong Delta. So again, remember, as I finish here, that's a lot of information, but feel free to take a look at the reference list, take a look at the little handout, the Mekong primer that I provided. And again, here's the big picture, the lifeblood of the Indochinese Peninsula. Let's hope that over time, that the best technologies and careful decision-making allow this river to thrive and adapt, because it is so important to the tens of millions of people who depend on it. And let's hope it's there for these little guys as well. So I thank you very much. That's quite a bit of information. I appreciate your time. I wish you all safe travels, smooth sailing on, be it oceans or rivers in Southeast Asia or anywhere in the world. And I look forward to meeting you personally someday. Thank you.